everybody. Welcome to another round of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. My name is David Parsons. I really appreciate you listening to the show. Thanks so much. It's been a while since I've posted an episode. I've been busy reading, writing, being a human being, but I've also been, watching American politics like everybody else and freaking out about what's been going on, and felt the need to, once again, take my recording equipment out into the world and have conversations with people smarter than I am to help me navigate the waters of this incredible garbage spectacle of American democracy that we call the 2016 presidential election. My guest today is no exception. He's someone who's been on the show before. I always value his perspective on politics. His name is Corey Robin. He's a professor of political science at Brooklyn College. You can find a lot of his opinions and takes on what's going on his blog, CoreyRobin.com. We had a great conversation about Bernie Sanders, about Donald Trump, and just he helped me put both of these figures in the kind of context, the larger context of the last several decades of American politics, which I love. I love to figure out a little bit of where all this comes from and where we might be going. So I had a really fun time talking with Corey, and I thank him for coming on the show. You can find more episodes of the Nostalgia Trap at nostalgiatrap.com. All of them are there for free. You can also like and share the show on Facebook, Twitter, all your other social media stuff. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for joining me again. This is my conversation with Corey Robin. Is it exhausting being a political scientist of the right now? It feels like a hyper-resonant moment for that particular group of people.
It should be. I mean, to be honest with you, I've been more interested in what's going on the left of late than I have been on the right. So I could be very exhausted by what's going on the right, but my attentions have been more focused elsewhere, to be honest.
Well, speaking of the right, there is a kind of feeling among I hear this feeling a lot around Trump, this idea that he came out of nowhere. I mean, would you agree with that notion, or would you put him on a kind of continuum with the things that have been going on the right for the last 30, 40 years? Or longer than that?
Well, I have a kind of complicated answer to that. I mean, the first part of the answer is that he's absolutely on a continuum with what has been going on. Just yesterday, the Republican Party in the Senate announced that they would refuse to hold any hearings whatsoever on any nomination that President Obama put forward for the Supreme Court. While that stance is not unconstitutional, there's nothing in the Constitution that requires them to hold hearings and to consider these nominees. Historically, that's certainly been the role, and they've come up with this completely cockamamie justification for it, namely that Obama's a lame duck president and we should allow the voters to have a chance.
That happened twice, right?
Exactly. I mean, he's still in his presidency. It's but it's an example of the sort of spirit of lawlessness that just courses throughout the veins of the Republican Party. This is the heart of the Republican Party right there. It doesn't get more establishment. It doesn't get more mainstream than the Republican Party in the United States Senate. We're not talking about out in the boondocks or something like that. And that is just an attitude that they have. And this doesn't come on out of nowhere. This comes on the last decade and a half, where they have stipulated that you need to have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate in order to pass legislation. They just came up with that out of nowhere. And now that's an accepted rule. That's the way we do business in Washington. They launched a war, which on completely false pretenses, and they were catapulted into power in 2000 on the basis of this spurious Supreme Court,
that's right,
cockamamie decision. I'm rehearsing that whole history, and we could go back even further if we wanted. But just to say that when people talk about Donald Trump as this lawless, contemptuous of protocol and of established conventions, and act like he's out of nowhere, I sincerely wonder, where the hell have you been?
Right.
As recently as yesterday. Because he is just a more colorful, flamboyant version of what the Republican Party has been for a very long time. And, as I argued in my book on conservatism, The Reactionary Mind, this is constitutive of what conservatism is. This is the politics of reaction. It's always this strange mix of elements.
Well, it is a strange mix, and I don't know if you would agree with this term, but it feels like your book, The Reactionary Mind, is kind of a psychobiography of the right. And I kind of like this, like what are the kind of streams of conscious and subconscious ideas that are going through this population? But one of the things that kind of strikes me as weird, and maybe you can square this for me, is I show this movie Berkeley in the 60s quite a bit in my class, and there's a clip. I show clips, and there's a great clip of Ronald Reagan coming in and telling all the professors that they should have taken the protesters from the free speech movement out by the scruff of their neck and throw them out, and like kind of running on that law and order kind of thing. And Nixon very famously ran on a law and order campaign in 1968 as well. So it's kind of interesting to hear you talk about this lawlessness, right? Kind of like Reagan was attacking specifically the idea of like civil disobedience, or the idea that you could that it was wrong to him to pick and choose which laws you were going to follow, and so it's just like an incredible kind of historical hypocrisy there. Or
not really, though. I mean, I think the whole point about law and order was it was never really about the rule of law at all. It was about it was institutional wilding. It was. I mean, didn't he? You said take him by the scruff of the neck at one point. He said force them to have a bath or something like that. Doesn't he have a quote like that?
Yeah.
I mean, it's really about brute force and the state exercising its will through violence. The fact that you could use the pretext that people were violating the law. Well, of course, the Republicans were always very silent about white Southerners who were violating the law. In fact, not silent, cheered them on and channeled that spirit into the Republican Party. So I don't think there's any or there's very little discontinuity, put it that way, on that score, because the whole notion of law and order was really about getting the police to clamp down on either protesters, and that's or later, it became something about really about allegedly about black crime, the face of black crime. But let me just say one thing, which I do think is different. So I don't think there's the lawlessness that you see now in the Republican Party and have seen for some time, that the contempt that they have for convention and norms and constitutional rules and procedures. I don't think there's anything particularly new about that. But one thing I was going to say that I think is different with Trump is that you see that he's taking certain positions, either on birth control and Planned Parenthood, on abortion, on free trade, against the Iraq War, that are breaks with at least the way the recent Republican Party has gone. And I think what's going on there, to understand that, you have to step a little bit outside the framework of understanding conservatism and understand it in a different framework, which is about the rise and fall of party regimes. In the United States, at least in political science, we talk about these, the Lincoln Republican regime from 1860 that either ended in 1896 or 1932, depending on who you ask. The New Deal regime from 1932 to 1980 with Ronald Reagan. And then, we've been pretty much in the Reagan era. And the thing that the political scientist Steve Skoranek, who's a historical political scientist at Yale, has argued about these regimes is that the further into them you get, the closer to the end of these regimes, the more you see the dominant regime, whether it was the Republican Party up until the years of Roosevelt, or the Democrats up through Jimmy Carter, and whoever now we are, Donald Trump. They're always scrambling at the end to reinvent and find a new way of constituting the regime. And the problem that they're facing, and so this is people like Herbert Hoover in the last term before FDR and Jimmy Carter. They made considerable innovations in the commitments of, for Hoover, the Republican Party, and for Carter, the commitments of the Democratic Party. I mean, a lot of what we associate with the neoliberal Democrats begin under Carter. And so they're in a race against time because they're trying to reinvent the party and put it on new electoral and policy standing, but they're doing it as the warrant or the legitimacy of their party's that party regime is running out. And so
it's an interesting idea. And the mask comes off a little bit, or you get to see something of something you didn't see before,
right?
Or something more.
Yeah, I mean, you see a lot of that, and it's and if Donald Trump wins the nomination and if he's elected, God help us. But whether it's him or somebody else, you're going to see a scrambling of the traditional commitments of the Republican Party, where certain elements are being jettisoned and other elements are being added in order to create a new electoral constituency.
Right.
And so that's what I think Trump, for all of his erraticness and recklessness, I think that's what you're seeing there, and that's very important. And it's a sign of a party it's on its last legs. I mean, I don't know how long that's going to be, but it's on its last legs, and that's what happens in these moments of party disintegration.
It feels like evangelicals, I mean, you mentioned Trump and his attitude towards birth control and abortion and other things that have kind of energized that constituency. It seems like the evangelicals, I mean, where did they go? I always felt like they were kind of the heart of whatever was happening, but in hindsight, does it seem like maybe they were not, or it was just a moment, or they were manipulated?
Well, I mean,
where are they?
I mean, I think they're there and they're important. But I think, I have a graduate student, in fact, Joanna Tice in the political science department, who's writing about the political thought of contemporary evangelicals. And her argument, which she's building off on a lot of scholarship that's out there, is that the election and the administration of George W. Bush was a bit of a disaster for evangelicals. I mean, that was their moment. And I think the combination of the financial crisis and then the Iraq War, just really tore that moment apart for them. And they felt like they came out of it still not with the prize of a 5-member Supreme Court majority that could overturn Roe v. Wade, and some of the, and if anything, views on gay marriage got more and more liberalized.
That's right.
Under their watch. So then this all culminated in the election of Barack Obama, and I think for a lot of evangelicals, what may be happening, this is my student's argument now, and I find the evidence she has adduced for this persuasive. What may be happening is that there's a kind of retreat that you see. Actually, it's part of the cyclical pattern of evangelical political activism going back a century. These moments of intense activity followed by either disappointment or repudiation in the dominant political regime, and then retreat and regrouping, and then they come back again. And so it could very well be that's what's going on right now.
It seems like a phenomenon that's kind of, in a weird way, mirrored on the left as well, because you had a candidate like Barack Obama. With a lot of people on the left saw them like evangelicals might have seen George W. Bush. This is our perfect candidate. This is who we've been waiting for. This is the quote unquote change we can believe in, right? But the kind of discourse of disappointment is a big part of how people on the left feel, and a big part of, I think, driving obviously the Clinton-Sanders thing on the Democrat side. It feels like both parties, or not parties, but both sides of the political coin in America have been disappointed by these quote unquote pure candidates that didn't do what they wanted them to do. They're kind of like the limits of American change, or however you want to frame that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt. And I've seen this, actually WNYC I think it was the night of the New Hampshire primaries, did an amazing set of interviews with people who were first-time voters in 2008 and cast their ballots for Obama, and talked to them about how that experience and what they've seen since then. So you're talking about people who would have been, 18, 20 years old and are now in their mid to late 20s. And it was all of them. They were all Sanders supporters. It didn't matter if they were white or black or Latino. In fact, most of the people they interviewed were black and Latino. But it was all the same story of disappointment. And,
what were they disappointed with? How did Barack Obama let us down?
Well, I mean,
or at least the young people who voted for him.
I think they. I mean, Barack Obama talked about change, and depending on who you were, you could read different things into that. I think what he really meant was a new spirit of conciliation between the parties and finding, a new kind of dialogue. And that was obviously a very weak tea, and it didn't happen. But the more strenuous, the deeper reading of that, and this is what all realignment presidents do, Jefferson, Lincoln, Roosevelt, and Reagan, is a kind of a scrambling of the electoral map, and to say that the gridlock you've experienced thus far is about to be smashed to bits, and we're going to, what does Jefferson say? We're all Federalists, we're all Republicans. It sounds so anodyne, but what is he doing as he's saying that? He's completely reorchestrating the fundamental commitments of the federal government in a radically anti-federalist party, pro-Jeffersonian direction. And Lincoln likewise oftentimes uses that language of reconciliation while he's, smashing the slaveocracy. So I think people could read in Obama a promise of something deeper, which, in the end, I think people like Adolph Reed and others have established, it really wasn't his politics. He really was, and you could see this in hindsight, a continuation of the Clinton years in the 90s. So I think that was the disappointment. But I think there's a difference in the disappointment between the right and the left. I mean, the right's disappointment is coming on decades of mobilization, of organization, of agitation, education that began in the 1960s. Evangelical voters came a little bit later on the scene. They came, in the 1970s. Late 60s, 70s, and things like abortion came even later, really. It was more toward the late 1970s that became the major issue for evangelical voters.
Right.
And they have been doing this for an awfully long time and saw one disappointment from their perspective after the other. Ronald Reagan appoints Sandra Day O'Connor, Anthony Kennedy, both of them uphold Roe v. Wade, although chip it back. And George W. Bush was supposed to – that was the lock.
Yeah.
And he meant it that way too. I mean, I think he understood himself as well. He wasn't going to appoint a Souter or somebody like that. He appointed Alito
and
Roberts. Two very solid conservative.
Almost Harriet Miers. Does anyone remember that?
That was a brief moment. But anyway, so that was the culmination of decades. I think.
And the left has not been mobilized like that.
No, not at all. I mean, the Obama thing was very new. And I think Jedediah Purdy, who's a professor at Duke Law School, has made the point that, Obama's campaign was really about him more than anything else. It was really about – I mean, he embodied the hope and the change that people believed in because he's black president in this white country.
And there's a lot of projection involved. Yeah. His books, I think, made a difference in some ways.
Yeah.
It's kind of like overall – I don't know. You're right. I mean, I think it was personality more than anything else.
Way personality, much more than any substantive set of ideas. Whereas with Sanders, it's the opposite. He's an anti-personality.
Yeah.
But what he is this distillation of this, disgust with, the whole economic inequality, and the desire to once again use government on behalf of a program of comprehensive redistribution and regulation. But that's a very new language. In some ways it's old, but in other ways it's a language that we haven't heard in a very long time. So I think disappointment for the left now can actually be more energizing and more motivating. I think these are what I would call, or there's a professor up at UMass, Eve Weinbaum, calls successful failures. There are failed failures which do nothing but demobilize and send people to say, there was no point. We should have never done anything. Let's give up.
Right.
There are successful failures where you feel like, okay, we may not get it this time, but everything is going our way and we'll get it right the next time. And I think you have seen that. I mean, I think in some ways it began, in terms of social movements, it began with the Seattle stuff in 1999, some of the anti-war protests, Occupy, you have a whole social movement trajectory that's happening. Black Lives Matter now, and then some of these kind of campaigns, for all of its problems, the Nader campaign, the Dean campaign, the Obama campaign. You see people getting it together slowly, and it takes time, and you're going to fail, and it may not happen this time. Sanders, at this point, may really well lose the nomination, but all the demographics are pointing in the right direction. And equally important, the American ruling class and political establishment shows absolutely no ability to confront the problems that are driving people to somebody like Sanders.
Right. And it feels like, Trump is cast as this kind of problem for the Republican Party, right? They're not sure what to do with him. Do you think Sanders is equally a problem for the Democratic Party? I
think he's a bigger problem for the Democratic Party. Trump, for whatever, however frightening he is for many people, and I think there's multiple reasons, but I think the main reason he's so frightening to them is that he doesn't come from any kind of wing of the Republican Party. He didn't work his way up. He's completely coming from the outside. But ultimately, what Trump is doing, and he may not be the one to be able to pull it off in the end. It may be somebody else down the road. He's showing the Republican Party that they need to remix the elements. They're going to have to jettison certain elements and embrace others that they may have been nervous about in order to carry on their fundamental commitments. So he may be scary to them, but in a way he's necessary to kind of reconstituting that party in a viable way. Sanders is different because what Sanders is saying to the mainstream Democratic establishment is that everything that you have been you're not even a party anymore. You've been a shadow party that has whose sole constructive role has been the maintenance of neoliberalism and contemporary capitalism with a slightly more human face.
Well, in this scenario, Sanders, I feel like, and I'm maybe cynical about this, but it feels like the moment that we're waiting for is Sanders is going to lose a few primaries and endorse Hillary. And I just imagine that being a disappointing moment for a lot of young people. It seems like I don't know how they're casting this as, well, Sanders is the best and Hillary is a second best, or is it Sanders is the only, because Hillary so much represents that the kind of problems with the Democratic Party and with left politics in general. I don't know if I can call her left at all, but I wonder how that will damage people. Because when I say damage, I was like 21 or 22 when Bush versus Gore happened, and it was enormously damaging to my sense of what was possible in the country. I think I was a little bit of an idealist, and that kind of took away a lot of feeling. It made me completely, disillusioned, very, very disillusioned. I feel like that's a danger with the Sanders candidacy in some respects.
Yes and no. That's always a danger with any movement.
Because he's not good. He's not going to challenge the Democratic Party. He's not going to really. He's not willing to really kind of burn it down in order to make, especially if he doesn't have the support he thinks he's going to have.
I don't. It's hard to play prognosticator, and I always feel like everything I always predict turns out to be wrong. So I'm always leery of doing it. But I think what we can say is that my sense of why people are drawn to him has very little to do with him. I don't think he's not. He doesn't have that kind of charisma that Obama had.
He's got that kind of Larry David, Saturday Night Live,
sort of anti-charisma,
right?
But still, that appeals to maybe some of us. But I oftentimes have to remind myself that he's actually not Larry David.
Right.
I actually literally think that that's who I'm talking about when I'm speaking about him.
Yes.
But
it's the Tina Fey, Sarah Palin thing.
Right.
You can't tell the difference anymore.
But anyway, I don't think that's what people have going for it. And so what he does in the end, I don't think is going to be that. I don't think it's people think like God, he's the savior or something like that.
Right.
If that's what he does, that's what he does. But people clearly, I think, are going to. I mean, the way, at least how I read it, is like this is their movement. Like this, they're the ones who have the power on their side. And when you have, young people under the age of 45 or whatever the saying, like words like socialism don't scare us, capitalism seems more of a problem. I mean, is a much more energy within them than there is. So I think there's that going on the one hand. On the other hand, what you can't forget is there are other Democrats who are watching this, people that we don't know, we have not been paying attention to, who are ambitious in the good and bad senses of that word, who want to catapult them. I mean, it's a strange ambition to want to be president of the United States, but there are apparently people who want to do it.
Kurt Vonnegut said that was the flaw in our system. Only psychopaths want to be president.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I've always wondered about people like this.
Yes.
What would make you want to become president of the United States? I mean, interesting with Sanders. It's another thing that he's got going for them is that he seems to actually have had very little interest in this and only ran the campaign originally in order to get these ideas out there more than anything else.
Seems like he picked his moment really well.
Yeah.
When I look at Sanders now and seeing what's happening, it would have. I don't know, first of all, I think it would have been a major liability for the Democratic Party to have basically an empty stage next to Hillary, right? Yeah. Where it's kind of obvious the idea of this like coronation. It's just hers. And Martin O'Malley. I don't know. I don't even know what that is, but. But yeah, in a certain sense, Sanders kind of legitimizes Clinton in the sense that his presence kind of lends the idea that we're watching democracy in action, when we're watching the ideas be debated out.
Right. But I do think that the point is that there are other people waiting in the wings, maybe not at the national level, maybe at the state level, who are watching this and are saying to themselves, "Okay, this is the direction that the voters are heading," and I don't think it's quite. With some people, it is obviously that cynical and strategic. With others, they can. Politicians are chameleons. They can go either way. Depending on, and a good politician will sense this and start developing a program. And so, that sense of disillusionment and disappointment you're talking about, that's a response to events, but they can be challenged by political leadership. Right. But let me say the last thing is that it may very well be that the Democratic Party is completely unable, in the end, to shed the 30 to 40 to 50 years of financial corruption, in the deepest sense of that term, and neoliberalism that it has embraced. That the money wing of the party is just too dominant, and it may very well be that this is going to come from somewhere else. This is the other thing I really would stress about this campaign, and it's one of the things that drives me crazy in a lot of the commentary is how slavishly devoted people are to models of political action and political rules that were forged over the last however many decades, and they act as if they are the laws of physics and that they are inalterable. And if this campaign has shown nothing else, it's that a lot of the assumptions that are presumed to be, the iron law of American politics, of modern American politics, may not hold. And so, we're very used to having a two-party system. We've had it for a very long time. That may be the permanent structure of American politics, or it may change. Or you may see a different kind of, I think for many of us, the Democratic Party we know, is at best, the party from the 1970s onwards. Yeah. But the Democratic Party of the 1940s and 1930s, in some ways was worse, in some ways much better. It was a very different animal. And so these things change. And,
the Democrats are following always. Or, there's this feeling that, with the Supreme Court thing, that I don't know what Obama and what the Democrats are planning to do to counter this idea from the Republicans that we're just not going to consider a single nominee. We're not even going to meet with them. It seems like an important moment for the Democrats and Obama to stand up for themselves, and especially I don't vote for Democrats, and part of the reason and what I've heard from a lot of people over the years is that that's wrong because of the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. You should no matter what you think, you should vote for Democrats because they're Supreme Court nominees, and that's the most important thing. And here we are, okay, we have Scalia was a pretty important Supreme Court justice, we have an opportunity here, and we're just going to say, well, maybe we should let the people. I mean, if they fall into the Republican, it seems like it not only sets a horrible precedent, but it also continues what the Democratic Party's approach has been to this kind of lawlessness, as you call it, from the Republican Party.
Yeah, I mean, this is what this is how the 2000 election went. I mean, just think about that election. I mean, for the left, elections, voting, this is just, these are bourgeois rights, right? These are, this is what the bourgeoisie does to kind of buy off the working class. We offer you this patent of choice with the vote and an election, right? Mm-hmm. And what we do, though, to make sure that doesn't matter is that deep behind the scenes, we structure the choice so it's not really much of a choice, right? But you get to exercise that. What's been amazing to me about what the Republicans have done over the last 2 decades between their assault on voting rights, their position in the 2000 election, I mean, Gore won more popular votes, right? He won more votes, right? Kind of the sine qua non of an electoral democracy. The loser got power, right? The loser got power.
At a critical moment as well.
Yeah, but even setting all that aside, and then this issue I brought up earlier about the insistence from the Republicans and the Democrats' capitulation to this, that any piece of legislation has to have a filibuster-proof majority.
That seems like a recipe for a government that's never going to function.
Well, not only is it that, you are institutionalizing anti-democracy.
Right.
Anti-bourgeois democracy, not anti-social democracy, not anti-radical democracy, the basic procedural democracy. You're institutionalizing a check against it by saying you have to have a supermajority in order to pass legislation, by saying the person who gets the lesser number of votes can nevertheless win, by saying that even if somebody was elected president and has a year to go in his term, he still has just simply no right to make appointments to the Supreme Court. You're just institutionalizing checks on the most minimal definition of bourgeois democracy. And then also setting up all kinds of rules at the level of the state, ensuring that, black voters can't vote and all the rest of it. And, there's this whole old argument in European history that it was socialism that brought liberalism to Europe, right? That it was socialism that brought enlightenment to Europe. Not socialism. Socialists did not bring socialism. They brought bourgeois democracy. They made that happen. And you're seeing
bourgeois democracy arising as a buttress against socialism,
both as a buttress against it, but also it was socialist parties. I mean, Pareto, kind of very dyspeptic observer, said, the most evident, the loudest cries for freedom and the greatest evidence for the desire for freedom is coming from the socialists, and he was no socialist, when he said that. So both as a buttress against it, but also as the demand, socialists demanded the vote. Socialists demanded freedom of the press. All these kind of bourgeois freedoms and bourgeois liberties were really things that the left fought for very, very hard, and it took, the left to get. And without a left in the United States, what are we seeing but the erosion of these very minimal definitions of bourgeois democracy? And you have a Democratic Party that can't even defend itself as a party. Not its constituencies, not the working class, not African Americans, but itself as an institutional entity. It can't even do that. And so that's why sometimes I wonder if the kind of crisis we're heading towards is not much bigger than Sanders and Clinton, but really whether or not the Democratic Party has any future as a political party at all.
Yeah. I mean, I hear in my head when you're talking about kind of Republican obstructionism, I feel like there are a lot of partisan Democrats that are big Obama fans that are going to cast his presidency as that way, right? I think basically that nothing was Obama's fault. Essentially, he was basically facing a Congress that said no to everything he did. Is that a narrative that you accept at all, or do you kind of put a little more blame on Obama for that?
I mean, I think that's just not true. I mean, the thing that I paid a lot of attention to for several years was the whole negotiation around debt and debt ceiling. And, a lot of people claim, Obama couldn't do anything. But Obama, right out of the gate said, put Social Security on the table, accepted, not retiring the Bush-era tax cuts.
Thank you for reminding me about that. I remember jumping up and down in my kitchen, reading that in the morning about Obama putting Social Security on the table. I totally forgot about that, and that was one of the first times where I was like, I know who this guy is now.
Yeah, and the agreements that they finally reached, were really bad. And just yesterday, the day before, I meant to post about this. Obama, one of his great achievements as president over the last 2 terms is that he has radically cut the deficit. Because it was, remember, in 2009, 2010, it was ballooning. We were facing $1 trillion. But
it's the obsession of the Clinton years.
He has
balanced the budget.
The Peterson Commission, right? We are back almost to the level it was when George W. Bush, which was still $400 billion, but whatever. But we're back to that level. But here's the kicker of that: the great pride and joy achievement of the Obama administration. Go team. The American people still believe that Obama has increased deficits more than the Republicans did. Because and either they don't care or they get it wrong. But what have you accomplished for that? And we're not back to pre-recession levels of employment amongst youth voters. I was just looking at this recently. It's still we have just not yet recovered. I mean, we haven't even recovered all the lost years from 2008 to where 2016 now.
Yeah, it's a pretty weak argument for any kind of recovery. It seems like.
I mean, that's partially what these Sanders voters. What's driving them? I mean, just do the math.
Do you think Sanders voters are also driven by Obamacare being a little disappointing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I talk to a lot of people who are in the 20-something age range who are off their parents' plans by now, or 30-something, and who are writers or whatever, and Obamacare has been a real disaster for them, and many of them have just decided it's cheaper
to pay the $300 fine.
Yeah.
And
to just do it that way.
It just feels like whenever the government says, prove to us that you paid a corporation money or we'll take the money from you directly, it seems like something's wrong, right? And it seems like extortion to me. And the first notion I had of that, and I think it's present in a million different ways, but in California, when they passed auto insurance and you have to have auto insurance, my first thought was, God, I'd love to own an insurance company to make it a law that you have to buy this.
Right.
And I mean, we could talk forever about insurance not being healthcare at all, right? And they're two separate things. But I feel like that's one of the nastiest bits from the whole Obama age is the selling of Obamacare.
As universal health care.
Right, but also just it preserved the most obnoxious and damaging element of the whole healthcare system in the United States, which is the idea that companies make profit off of healthcare. And the fact that was never addressed and that was kind of seen as that has to be a part of this kind of tips Obama off as who he is, with a neoliberal. Like for him, it's like solutions through profit and through private solutions over public solutions, and it feels like a lot of people anticipated some kind of New Deal or something from Obama. And when you go back to 2008, I don't think he was suggesting that at all.
No, quite the opposite. And this is my own personal bugaboo, but about insurance, I deal with insurance companies all the time, just for my family's health care, and it's a nightmare. And I have a PhD and a relatively large amount of free time compared to your average American worker, and I find it maddening to have to deal with these insurance companies, and that's just that's the insurance part of the whole equation. That's not about healthcare. That's about insurance. And I keep thinking to myself whenever I hear people talk about, no, you have to do this, the insurance company's that, and we have to be realistic, that I can't be the only person in the United States who feels this way. Like, and we have relatively good insurance.
Yeah. Even the good insurance. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Chelsea Clinton came out a few weeks ago and said that Americans like their system of private insurance, and I just found that like such an absurd statement. I don't think I could find anyone who would say, "Oh, I really like my insurance."
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what it's doing is it's a bit of a bait and switch, because the classic thing against socialized medicine is I like my doctor, right? I like my private doctor, and I don't want the state telling me who I can see. That has now been either expanded or shifted to be like, I like my Cigna. I have a personal relationship with Aetna.
It's horrifying.
And I think most people just don't really feel that way.
Right. Well, I mean, to go back to that white working class idea, Donald Trump supporters, I assume, are this quote unquote white working class. I'm guessing they seem to be kind of. There's even kind of union talk amongst it, and I mean, there is a history, obviously, like unions, racism, populism, all that kind of stuff. Are we seeing kind of a revealing of the Republican constituency that's, I don't know, it's been there, been dormant? It feels like that feels like the kind of the importance of the Trump moment is kind of giving the lie to, I guess, the Thomas Frank idea of like, oh, these people have been voting against their interests for so long. It seems like there is a kind of economic populism to what Donald Trump is suggesting or stirring up. I don't know if he understands that.
I hate to be the political scientist here. I haven't really looked at the polling data enough in the exit polls to see where he's getting his support from in these things. I mean, the first thing, and I know it's still a multi candidate race, but the fact of the matter is, he's never gotten a majority of the vote in any primary. The most he got was just the other day in South Carolina when he got 40%, and there it seemed like a lot of what was driving the voters was just pure racism, pure and simple. Now, whether or not that was predominantly amongst white working class voters versus higher income voters, I don't know. I mean, the thing to remember about this whole white working class Republican thing, I mean, Larry Bartels, in his critique that he did of Tom Frank's stuff, he looked at all the statistical data, and outside the South, most working class, low income voters vote Democrat. You just don't have this I mean, I know it has a kind of cachet, particularly amongst American historians.
Yes.
The Reagan Democrat. It's a very storied story, but
it's kind of condescending too, though. What's the matter with Kansas idea? No,
well,
no offense, Tom Frank.
I mean, even setting that aside, whether it is or it isn't, the data doesn't really show it. Where you do see white working class voters going Republican is in the South. In the same way that more elite Democrats, more elite voters went Republican. I mean, it's just part of the shift in the South and the shifting of the parties. I mean, it was this historic accident that the Democratic Party was made up of, Northern workers, and then Southern racists. And the last half century of American politics has been about the sorting out of that, the shuffling out of the reshuffling of the party. So, I think that, we just should be careful in making speculation about that.
We talk about identity stuff real quick because we have a woman running for president, but we also have, and it's not mentioned hardly at all, that there's a Jewish guy running against her. And that's kind of like they're historic candidacies in both respects, and yet I don't know, Hillary didn't play this thing in 2008 too much, and maybe that was because she was like running against Barack Obama. I'm not sure, but she never really played. There were a couple moments last week with it. Was it Gloria Steinem and Madeleine Albright kind of making asses of themselves and saying, in a very crass way that like you should vote for Hillary because she's a woman.
Right.
I don't know why is that popping up? Why is that popping up now for her instead of in 2008? It's a kind of weird time for that, and it seems like also a split in feminism because a lot of young women are voting for Sanders.
Yeah.
And Sanders doesn't invoke it's in the Times today, right? That he plays himself off as a very secular person. He doesn't play up the
right.
My thought is, and I could be totally wrong about this, and you may not even want to comment on this, but my thought is, I feel like there are more people in America who would vote against Sanders for being a Jew than would vote against Hillary for being a woman. And I know that's an impossible question to answer.
I don't know about I don't know. But the identity question the way identity politics is playing out is kind of interesting. in multiple respects. But one of the things that fascinates me is that, and people forget this, but Bill Clinton. And when you say Bill Clinton, you also have to always say Hillary Clinton, because they were a partnership from the get-go. I mean, she was extraordinarily – she was not just a first lady. No. She was not just a candidate's wife. She was a full, equal partner in the creation of the Clintons, but also in the creation of the politics that we associate with Clintonism. He gave this very famous turning point speech to the Democratic Leadership Council in 1991, and she wrote most of it, or helped write a good part of it. And, so these were ideas that they really developed together. So that being said, he came into office, into the scene, really repudiating the kind of racial politics of Jesse Jackson, the Rainbow Coalition, and so forth. And the claim was, we have to recover the white working class that we've lost. So it was really, a kind of de-emphasis on identity. As it capital I, as it's usually understood.
Sure.
Because of course the white working class is also an identity, but it was a real de-emphasis on identity as it's traditionally understood, in favor of a kind of, for lack of a better word, a kind of class politics. And what did we get out of that? We didn't get working class politics. And we certainly didn't get progress for African Americans. What we got was corporate neoliberalism, right? And that became the brand of the Democratic Party. Here we are, 24 years later, and another Clinton is on the ticket, and she in a race against a candidate who, above all else, wants to repudiate the Clintonization of the Democratic Party and the corporate, the neoliberal corporate model of politics. And this time, she's using the kind of identity politics that they rejected in the name, in order to defend that corporate brand of neo.
Seems like a defensive move then, in the way you're casting a little bit. It's kind of like a re-engagement of something that they know might work.
Yeah, but sort of flipping it,
Right.
But it's very defensive. It's self-professedly defensive in the sense that, it flared up over the summer around Black Lives Matter and Bernie Sanders, and again in the fall around the Bernie Bros. But it was only until after Iowa, and Clinton's campaign manager was very clear about this. Like, we need a real message, and race. It's not all about the economy, stupid. Right? It's not about the economy, stupid. That became the thing, not in order to win an election, right? Not in order, to set a new policy course, and not even to win a presidential general election, but to get her through 3 months of a Democratic primary campaign.
Right.
And so it seems to have, I think, for many people, whether she wins or loses, I think in the end, for anybody who cares about feminism, who cares about civil rights, African Americans and Latinos, the real bread and butter of identity politics, who really cares about that, I think this has come at a huge cost, because it has been revealed to be, in this instance, the most naked, cynical political strategy. I don't think there's anybody who really believes that in her heart of hearts, that what Hillary Clinton is fighting for, is for the Rainbow Coalition.
Well, it's also weird. It's always cast in this kind of like break the glass ceiling of business, as if feminism is just women becoming CEOs, right? And it's cast as a very, very kind of,
right.
It's cast for people with money, essentially.
And I thought, Sarah Leonard in The Nation, I thought, wrote a really excellent piece.
I saw that piece. It was a great piece
last week, and and she gave the argument its due. Women academics who I speak, in my industry, will tell you all the time the kind of sexism that women face in elite positions, and you'd have to be insane to deny that. It speaks to a very, very real experience.
But that's what's disturbing about seeing it engaged cynically, I think.
Right. Yeah, it's not really. I think this is where Sarah Leonard comes out in the piece, it's however much it speaks to that experience, it's missing an opportunity to universalize from that experience, and to say this is symptomatic of broader, deeper structural problems, and that if women, I mean, the argument you could make is, look, if women at the top of the power ladder are experiencing these sorts of things, can you imagine what's going on at the bottom?
Women that are cleaning motel rooms.
Right.
Yeah.
Can you imagine? And therefore, a comprehensive overhaul, is in order of the whole, structural, and not on the premise that if you overhaul the economy, you've solved all the problems of sexism or racism.
Right, because, it just proves that just what we're saying right now is, the elite women experience sexism.
Right, of course.
To a high degree.
That shows that you also need gender-conscious policies, and this is where I get really irritated with this debate, because it would be one thing if Bernie Sanders had this record of, very solidly kind of economic redistributive policies, but terrible on affirmative action, terrible on defending abortion rights, terrible on, anti-discrimination against women and black people and so on. But he doesn't. He has a very good record on all those things. So, the notion that these things are being pitted against each other is, I think, to my mind, is the most distressing part of this whole discussion.
Yeah, it's kind of a false.
And I think, in all fairness, I think Sanders supporters have sometimes played into that by, getting caught up in, I hate this phrase, I'm old enough to remember, but I do remember those debates about class versus identity in the 80s and 90s. God. And they weren't fun.
Yeah.
They weren't fun.
Right.
And to kind of rehash it at that level in such a polarized way is a mistake all around.
Yeah, it seems like it's an impossible conversation and an endless one, and one that does not produce a lot.
No, it ensures. All it does is ensure what we saw during the Clinton years, which is that corporate neoliberalism wins.
Yeah, when I had Frances Fox Piven on the show, I asked her about identity politics and what she thinks about it. It's kind of like I don't know, its effects on American politics in general, and she's kind of dismissed. She's like, it's American history. It's all you can do about it. There's nothing you can do about it. It's just American history. That's just the way things flow, And I thought that was kind of one of the best answers. I don't want to take a lot of your time, but I do want to bring up one last thing about Bernie Sanders. Is that a lot of people bring up the foreign policy with Bernie Sanders, and you're someone who I have seen pictures of you on Facebook laying down in the street and getting arrested over the Israeli-Palestine thing. So I know you have strong feelings about it. How do you square Bernie Sanders and Israel and all of that? Because it's kind of bizarre how little foreign policy is playing into this election.
I would broaden the point. Obviously, at the level of my own commitments on Palestine, I find it upsetting that Sanders has said so little about this, and sometimes the things he has said have been real problems. Although I have been pleasantly surprised that his record is actually a lot more mixed upon this. He's really gone back and forth. Which I didn't realize. I thought he was sort of just a down the line liberal Zionist, but he's been quite critical at times. But I think there's a bigger issue here, and I think it's that back in the 60s, 70s, the left had a real critique of American imperialism, and that was connected to its social democratic vision at home. There's all kinds of problems, with that critique, and it could be very simple-minded. But just at the simplest level, how much? You saw this as late as the Jackson campaign, against in 1988. How much of the American budget, the federal government's budget, just goes to the military? And, Sanders has been very brave about raising the issue of taxes and saying, what, it's not just going to be on the billionaires. Middle-class people are going to have to raise taxes, and I think this is great. But what he's not said in this campaign is Bill Clinton, forget Jesse Jackson, Bill Clinton, to his credit, in 1992 and 1993, pushed for the peace dividend, for a downsizing of the military.
I remember Republicans freaking out about that throughout the 90s.
But I think
the draft dodger ruins the military.
Right, but he was somewhat successful in doing some of that stuff. And that something happened to Sanders, I think. And you see Sanders saying many similar things, but he just doesn't say it anymore. And I don't know if it, you could say it's a political calculation. It just doesn't seem worth the headache. I suspect it's more than that. It's just the way we've normalized in the last 20 years the idea of the United States as the imperial hegemon. That it just seems almost beside the point to people on the left to even challenge some of this stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think the effects of 9/11 and the war on terror have been tremendously bad.
Yes.
But so I think it's this is the big 800-pound gorilla in the room that has to be dealt with, which is the whole question of foreign policy. Mm-hmm. That said, and I've been critical of Sanders about this, but that said, there's also something to be said for somebody whose whose most basic instinct is be careful about getting involved. That do no harm in today's context. I mean, it's not you can't really build a whole platform, but it's certainly a hell of a lot better than everything you see in the Republican Party and a lot of what you see in the Democratic Party.
I don't know why any voter would consider anybody but Bernie Sanders at this point. He seems to me like the only candidate that's for real, and by that I mean that's playing a politics that seems connected to. And that's what's funny is that he's the candidate that most people are casting as this fantasy candidate, right? It's like unreal,
right?
Like he's in a fantasy land. I find his politics very direct. I find his policies very easy to understand and very
but it's
common sense almost.
It's not even just the level of policy. I find the way the politics of this campaign gets reported to be this weird fun house. So this presumption that Hillary Clinton is the most electable candidate, it just seems so reflexive among so many people.
I thought she was one of the most hated people in America.
She has terrible favorability ratings, but beyond that, I mean, you can see that, she has certain I watch her in the debates. She can be very good in those debates, but it's, somebody said this. I can't remember who. It's like a trial lawyer. She's like she gets these little moves, but
or a corporate lawyer.
A corporate lawyer. Yeah, exactly. But kind of misses a lot of the bigger picture, and the fact that Sanders has been able to run circles around her. This guy who's got again zero charisma. Or
he's got a charisma. It's a very particular charisma.
It's a kind of a exactly. It's just it's kind of fascinating to watch that.
Yeah, I mean, is it wrong to read politics through presidential elections? It seems like it's like every 4 years we get political, which is kind of weird. I mean, your understanding of politics is obviously on a kind of like longer scale than that, but it feels like if we want to move past this kind of two-party divide, we have to kind of move past these big, giant corporate stage-managed elections every year.
But I think we do. I mean, a lot of the people who are involved in the Sanders stuff are people who were very involved in Occupy.
Mm-hmm.
There are people
Black Lives
Matter. So,
something is happening with the left in terms. What I'm hearing from you is like, you had started off by saying that the right had this kind of project. Evangelical people were mobilized for decades, where the left has been kind of very diffuse and very weak and there, but in part not participating. It does feel like that you can point to things like Black Lives Matter and Occupy and things that are happening.
And I think what the Sanders campaign is done as well is that whereas Occupy, Black Lives Matter, the WTO protests, were protest politics, which are extraordinarily important. I think the Sanders campaign, for the first time, has given people a sense of a taste for power.
Yeah,
and that makes people on the left very nervous, for understandable reasons, but. The thing that I've always been struck by in watching the left and talking, to the left, if you compare, the Roosevelt administration, the people in the Roosevelt, from on high to the
whole New Deal coalition,
the whole New Deal was that they had a real appetite for power, and they had a real sense that the business class had been so thoroughly delegitimated and so thoroughly repudiated. And they had a sense that we can run this country, and we can do it better than they can. from the most technocratic level to the most redistributive, egalitarian justice vision level. I think the left, I mean, this is psychoanalyzing the left. I think for many, many years in the left, there's been a kind of secret sense like, thank God we actually don't have power because, they know what to do. Mm-hmm. I think what we're beginning to see is the unraveling of that. It's the sense that, in fact, they don't know what to do. And I think this campaign, the way all these elites have gotten behind this candidate, not just this candidate, this politics that is so out of touch with what so many voters want. That was you're too young to remember this, but that was the thing about Bill Clinton. I mean, I loathed Bill Clinton from the second I knew of him.
The saxophone didn't win you over?
No, it never did. I mean, he just,
he's good at playing the game.
He reminded me of everybody I hated from college.
Yeah.
But the thing that he had going for him was that he, allegedly knew, he understood the most cynical dimensions of politics, wielding the levers of power. Mm-hmm. And I think what we've seen is over the last, that those people don't wield the levers of power. The levers of power wield them. Mm. And I think that's what I've been most impressed by in the Sanders campaign, not Sanders himself or his advisors, but the people who are defending him and advocating for him, is a willingness to go kind of head to head and to say, no, you actually don't know what you're doing. You don't have competence.
Right.
You don't have the skills you think you have.
Corey Robin, it always makes so much more sense to me when I listen to you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.